frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. If you take this and pull that temporal lobe apart there and get in there, you have this area here, and what's that?
Insula.
Insula.
Just underneath it.
And you can see it here too. There's your insula. Just that stuff there. So, what's this here?
Your olfactory
The
bulb.
olfactory
Olfactory bulb, and then that's olfactory tract. Olfactory bulb, olfactory tract. Okay. What's this stuff here?
Lateral ventricles.
Yeah. People on the second bench, somebody back there behind you, grab that ventricle model. There you go. Cool. So here's those lateral ventricles. You can see them. They actually have horns to them, and they empty into this ventricle here. People on the second bench, what's this ventricle? Third ventricle. Third ventricle. Okay. That's the third ventricle. So here is, what's this here, guys?
Corpus callosum.
Corpus callosum. And here it is here. Corpus callosum. What's this little white line below it?
Fornix.
Fornix. And this tan area between them?
Septum.
Septum pellucidum. If you poke a hole through there, you'd be in the lateral ventricle. Okay. Septum pellucidum. And this blue stuff right here.
Choroid plexus?
Yeah, choroid plexus. What's that do?
Cerebrospinal fluid.
Makes the CSF. Choroid plexus makes the CSF. Okay. Basal nuclei. On this model, here again is that
Corpus.
corpus callosum. And this here represents the fornix. This green thing does right here. Okay. And then these, that would be that insula, just the surface of it. But all this in here is gray matter, and that's, what's that, you guys?
Basal nuclei.
Basal nuclei are right in there. This is all basal nuclei. Okay.
So the insula is just the outside of that?
The insula is just the outside, that part of the cortex. Exactly. Okay. So, I think I covered everything there. Did I miss anything? No. Okay. So, you guys, what does the olfactory bulb sit on?
The frontal lobe.
The what?
The frontal lobe?
Well, that surface of it, yeah, but what bone does it sit on? What part of what bone? So the olfactory bulb represents first cranial nerve coming in, and olfactory is what?
Smell.
Smell.
Sphenoid?
You're close.
Ethmoid?
Ethmoid. What was that? A bunch of holes in that ethmoid.
Cribriform plate.
Cribriform plate. Remember that cribriform plate? So that's where you're going to have the first cranial nerve coming through. Right there. Exactly. What does the lateral ventricle communicate with, and through what structure? I don't think you guys necessarily, people on the second bench should know that better. What's the lateral ventricle communicate with? Anybody got it? So here's the lateral ventricle. So the fluid empties into what?
Third ventricle?
Third ventricle. And what's that connection there?
Interventricular.
Interventricular foramen. Yeah. What forms the roof of the lateral ventricle?
Corpus callosum.
Corpus callosum. Yeah, it forms the roof.
Oh, sorry, what was that question?
What's that?
What was the question again?
What forms the roof of the lateral ventricles? And that's that corpus callosum, and here you can see it right here. Here's that corpus callosum, there's the lateral ventricle. So it makes that roof right there. That corpus callosum's a lot broader, it's just how they're shown on these models. Okay. We okay with that? Mm-hmm. Cool, let's go to the second bench. People on this bench, go ahead and sit down. You guys get to sit down. You get to get pimped. It's called pimping when you get questions like brains and stuff. That's what they call it. So what do you guys got? What's your bench all about? Diencephalon, that's the next lower area, okay? And what's the diencephalon made of? The two main things. Thalamus and hypothalamus, okay? And so, just to get you kind of started here, okay? The area we're talking about, okay, is this area right here. This is where all that diencephalon is. Now, if you look here, there's a little bulge, a big bulge right here. What's that, you guys? Thalamus, that bulge right there. Okay, and you can see it here too. Here it is right here, that bulge.
Bulging in the third ventricle.
Yeah, And so what you have is, remember, this is the third ventricle right here on this model. Is my thumbs would represent the thalamuses on both sides, and there's a space between them. And so my thumbs would be the thalamuses, right, like that. And so that's what you have here. So we took off those basal nuclei, popped them off, and so this whole big bulge right in here is the thalamus. Okay, is the thalamus. And then here is the space between it would be that third ventricle. Okay, so we'll hook it up to the other thalamus, and you'll see that it kind of sits in between it then like that. So you pop that off, and there it is. So you got a thalamus on both sides, okay? Okay, so to help you orientate yourselves with this, you guys, when you get down around this diencephalon, the next thing we're going to look at the next bench is the brainstem. Sort of use the brainstem as a guide, okay? This would be the brainstem. Look at things anterior and posterior to it. So if you go anterior, the thing that hangs down the most anterior is this little pink thing. And what is that, you guys?
Pituitary gland.
Yeah, pituitary gland. You can see it sitting in that cella turcica, the sphenoid there. Now, if you just go between the pituitary and the brainstem is this little white dot right there. And what's that? Mammillary bodies. The mammillary bodies. Yeah. And on this model, okay. What I'm going to do is put this back on there. They're in green. See them there? Those two green mammillary bodies. So you can see why the first person that saw it, I don't know what he was thinking about, but obviously he was thinking about women's breasts or something. Green things. So that helps you. You can see them, you can pull apart. There they are right there. Okay, that's the mammillary body. Okay. And so the other thing you want to do then is go, okay, so there's pituitary mammillary bodies between it and the brainstem, see? There's the mammillary body. Go to the other side, the posterior side of the brainstem, and see that little pink thing sitting there. What is that?
Pineal gland.
Pineal gland, or you see a pineal body. And so if you look at this together, okay, here's that anterior side with the two mammillary bodies, green. Go to the posterior side, and that little bulge in the midline right there, only one by itself, is the pineal gland. Okay? Right there. Pineal gland. Okay, let me go back to your, again, you don't have a pituitary gland hanging off of here, but you can see where it was coming off of. See that little bump right there? And if you look, there's that pituitary gland hanging. What's it hanging off of? Infundibulum. The stalk that it's hanging off is called the infundibulum. Infundibulum. Okay. Infundibulum. Now, these two, my thumbs represent what now again? Thalamuses. And so if you look in that third ventricle, you go, oh, there's a hole there. Is that a hole? No. Yeah, it's not. No, it's not, because the third ventricle is a space. That's a space, so that's actually tissue. You know, it's just you got to kind of reverse your mind and go, yeah, this isn't solid. This is a space, and so that's tissue. So what it is there's a connection between the two thalamuses. And what's that connection called, you guys? Intermediate mass. And there you can see it, that little brown thing. So that's what would kind of, you think, go through that hole, but that's really not a hole. You know what I mean? Okay, so see that little brown thing is the intermediate mass. And you can see it here too. Okay, intermediate mass. Now remember, the lateral ventricles are going to communicate down the third ventricle, so it's going right here. And so it's between the two ventricles, and so it's going to be a hole that it travels through. What's that called, you guys?
Interventricular frame.
Interventricular frame. And here you can see it going here. If I take that off, you can see it. Let me do it this way. Sorry, I'm going to take that guy off. If I take that off, it's this little slot here. That's where the interventricular foramen is. And so that's where you're getting CSF going from the laterals down in the third ventricle. Right there. Okay? Interventricular foramen. Okay, with these two guys back together again, sitting right here where my fingers would be what? Your eyeballs. And so these two things here are your optic nerves that have been cut. And they cross in the midline, and that's the optic chiasm right there. And then they form this line here, optic tract. So optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract. Optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract. Optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract. And on this model here, there's your, what's that then? Optic chiasm. That's the optic chiasm. You don't see the optic nerve because it's over. You know, it's lateral still. So that's your optic chiasm right there.
Can you see the optic tract there?
No, see how that's lateral also? See how far lateral that is? Because that cut is mid-sagittal right there. So if you do that, you can see you're not going to see that on that half it. So there's the optic chiasm right there.
Thank you.
Zoom type. Did I cover everything, you guys? Okay, good, good. What part of what bone does the pituitary gland sit in? The sphenoid, yeah, good, good. Explain why a person with pituitary tumors may have visual field defects.
Press on the optic nerve.
Chiasm, yeah, the optic chiasm starts pinching that optic chiasm, exactly. What two spaces does the interventricular foramen connect?
Third ventricle, lateral, and ventricle.
Lateral to third ventricle, yeah. So we okay with that? Let's do the next bench. People on this bench get to sit down. So what do you guys got on this bench?
Midbrain.
Midbrain, is that it?
Cerebellum.
Yeah, so we got the whole thing was called the brainstem, right? And so the brainstem's made up of what three parts on this bench?
Midbrain, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata.
Midbrain, pons, and medulla. Cerebellum is hanging off the back of the brainstem. So what we're talking about is this stuff right here. Okay, here it is here. This is all brainstem. These represent those basal nuclei. Down in here, this bulge further down in here would be the thalamuses. Okay, and so all this right here. So the three parts to the brainstem are again the midbrain, pons,
Medulla oblongata.
medulla oblongata. Exactly, exactly. Okay, and so here again, midbrain, pons, medulla. Okay, so in the midbrain, the things you need to know there is, remember you have that third ventricle up here. Okay, right here. Well, this is the fourth ventricle. So that's what this represents on this model, is that fourth ventricle. By the way, on this model, the pink in here represents the choroid plexus. And so there's a connection between the third and fourth ventricle that goes through the midbrain, and that's what this is right here. And you can see it right here. And what's that, you guys, on this bench?
Cerebral aqueduct.
Cerebral aqueduct. And you can see it right here. There's that cerebral aqueduct. So on this model, here's your brainstem. Here's the midbrain right here. Here's the pons. And here's the medulla right there. And so that connection between where the third ventricle is in this space and the fourth ventricle. My Q-tip is in the fourth ventricle. And again, this area is this space between the two thalamuses is the third ventricle. Okay, and there's your cerebral aqueduct. You can actually see it here. It's this line right here. This is cerebral aqueduct right here. I don't know if you guys can see that. So remember, just for review's sake, brainstem anterior to it, hanging off here is going to be that pituitary gland. What were those two little green things? Mammillary bodies. We went posterior, and that midline was this thing right here, and that was the pineal gland. Now, do you see those four little bulges there? What's that, you guys? Corpora quadrigemini. And they're made up of two things. The two superior bulges are the superior colliculus. The two inferior bulges are the inferior colliculus. Right. You can see those here. There they are there. Superior colliculus on one side, inferior colliculus. I don't know if you can see them here or not. Yeah, here actually is a colliculus here. So, cerebral pedicles. That's these fibers out here. Okay. See all those fibers in the midbrain there? And you can see them here too. Those are the cerebral pedicles. Okay. Okay, next part is, what's this part right here? Pons. Okay, and then hanging off the pons, well, directly posterior to the pons. Okay, so here's the pons. Directly posterior, if I ask you, what is posterior to the pons? It would be this here. And what is that again? Fourth ventricle. And then posterior to that is this here, and that's the cerebellum. Exactly. So, here's that fourth ventricle right there, just posterior to the pons. And then the cerebellum's hanging off of that. So cerebellum, okay, is not part of the cerebrum. And the folds in it are called what? Folia. And see this little like worm between the two right here, that little ridge? What's that, you guys? Vermis, yeah, vermis. And then if you cut this, you'll see this thing that looks like white here. And what was that? Arbor vitae, your tree of life, arbor vitae. And you can kind of see it here too. See the arbor vitae? Okay.
Can we put Tree of Life on a test?
No, arbor vitae. And I do have people that do that because they forget. They just know what's the tree of life, and I go, well, I don't know. It depends upon which tree we're talking about. You know, there's a lot of trees of life. I think Moses had a burning tree too. You know, I don't know if that was a tree of life or tree of death, but middle cerebellar pedicle. That's where the cerebellum is connecting to the pons. And on this model here, it would be this flat area right here. Okay, and on this one would be this flat area here.
What was that?
Middle cerebellar pedicle. Middle cerebellar pedicle. Medulla. This area here, and this little bulge on either side that's colored here is what, you guys? Olive. See, the guy was drinking that day, you know, he was having martinis. He goes, this reminds me of my martini olives. And then, see these two columns in between the olives? What are those? Yeah, I know they're called medullary pyramids, but they look like columns. And here they are here. Here's the bulges, or the olives. There and there. And these two columns in between are the medullary pyramids. Okay. What two spaces does a cerebral aqueduct connect? Third and fourth ventricle. Injury to the cerebellum would result in what physical finding or symptoms?
Was a control of subconscious movements.
Not really. Yeah, a little bit. Not really, but it's mainly the person's conscious. What's their problem?
Balance.
Ataxia. In other words, they don't have coordination. So they walk like they're drunk.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, we ready for the last one? People on this bench get to sit down. So what they got is the meninges, you guys. And this is the best model for it right here, okay? And so if you drill a hole through the bone, the first meninges you hit is what, you guys? Duramater. And point the Duramater to me. Yeah, see, it's been cut. So normally it covers the whole cerebrum, but it's cut so it just has these edges. So this is Duramater. What's this surface right here then with the blood vessels in it? That's arachnoid. And you take that off, then you're left with what's the surface of the brain. That's the pia mater. Right, pia mater. So all those brains back there have pia mater on them. Okay. The dura folds down in between that longitudinal fissure between the hemispheres, and it separates them. And what's this here then? Falx cerebri. Falx cerebri right here. Falx cerebri. Okay. There's a little bit of a separation between the cerebellums. It's a picture in your book. It's right here. And we just don't have it on any of the models, but it would be the same stuff that was separating a little bit right here. And that would be then what? Falx cerebelli. Now, remember you have this transverse fissure and the cerebellum here. And so there's dura that runs between those two that separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. And what's that called?
No, the tentorium.
Tentorium cerebelli. And you can see it here. It's this white stuff right here between the cerebellum and here. That white stuff right there. Okay. Now, you collect blood in the midlines on these, where you're, and also CSF is being collected. And so these are sinuses, and there's this sinus right here. And which one's that?
Superior.
Sagittal. So you gotta say superior sagittal, and you can see it here too. This blue right here. Superior sagittal sinus. Right there. And then there's this one here. Inferior sagittal sinus. And where that normally is at, it sits right above this white thing here. What's that white thing? Corpus callosum. So right superior to that would be the inferior sagittal sinus. Would be there. And then there's this sinus right here. What's that? Transverse. There's other sinuses, you guys. You know, there's a straight sinus and there's a sigmoid sinus. We just don't see them good in the models. Okay. In fact, there is one skull model that shows it, and we'll look at those when we do vasculature. We'll look at those sinuses on it. Okay. What's the space between the arachnoid and the pia called? Subarachnoid space. And what's in there? CSF. So the subarachnoid space is where the CSF, so it would be between this layer and this layer, okay, between those two. And now you've got to reabsorb CSF, you guys, back into those sinuses, and we do it through what's called what? Arachnoid granulation. That's these little white dots here, and along in here, arachnoid granulations. Okay. Did I miss anything?
Can you show us where the superior sagittal sinus is again?
It's right here. See it there? That's actually right there. And then, see it right here?
Go over it later.
That's the superior sagittal sinus. So, what structures does the falx cerebri separate? Right and left cerebral hemispheres. Yeah, you want to say it. It separates the right and left cerebral hemispheres. But what structures does the tentorium cerebelli separate?
Cerebellum and cerebrum.
Cerebellum and cerebrum. Cerebellum and cerebrum. Where would you find a subdural hematoma? Yeah, deep to the dura. So it's usually in that subarachnoid space or in here. Okay. And where would you find an epidural hematoma? Between what two structures? Between the bone and the dura mater. Right. Exactly. So you'll hear those terms: epidural hematoma, subdural hematoma. So now you kind of know where they're at. Any questions about this? We okay with it? Okay, good, cool, you guys.